Somewhere beneath modern Alexandria, Egypt, lie the ghosts of an idea almost too ambitious to believe. A single building meant to hold everything humanity had ever learned. For centuries, popular imagination has told us its story ends in one catastrophic fire, one villain, one terrible night, and the sudden death of the ancient world's greatest treasure. But that story isn't quite true. The truth is stranger, slower, and more unsettling than a single blaze. To understand what really happened to the Library of Alexandria, we have to ask a harder question than how did it burn? We have to ask whether it was ever destroyed at all, or whether something quieter took it from us instead. This is an investigation. By the end of it, you'll be able to answer for yourself. Did humanity really lose its greatest treasure?
To understand why a library could become one of history's great mysteries, you first have to understand what Alexandria was built to be. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great founded a city on Egypt's Mediterranean coast and gave it his name. He wouldn't live to see it grow. Within a decade, his vast empire had fractured, carved up by his own generals in a scramble for power. One of them, Ptolemy, took Egypt for himself and inherited something no other kingdom had. Egypt was rich. The Nile's floodwaters produced grain surpluses so reliable they could feed the whole Mediterranean world. And Egypt held something else nobody else could offer: papyrus, the plant that made writing and books possible on a mass scale. Ptolemy and his successors had both the wealth and the raw material to attempt something genuinely unprecedented. So they built the Museion, a shrine to the Muses, the goddesses of art and knowledge. This wasn't a lending library in any sense we'd recognize today. It was closer to a temple crossed with a research university. Scholars lived there, ate together, argued together, and were funded by the crown to do one thing: gather and master all human knowledge in a single place for the first time in history. It was an extraordinary act of ambition, and it's precisely because that ambition succeeded, because Alexandria briefly did become the intellectual capital of the known world, that its disappearance still troubles us, 23 centuries later. By the time the Museion was fully underway, it had become something the ancient world had never quite seen: a machine for organizing human knowledge itself. Consider the problem its scholars faced. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Nobody knows the exact number, and ancient estimates range from tens of thousands to nearly 500,000, arrived at Alexandria with no consistent system for finding anything. A poet named Callimachus of Cyrene solved it. His Penakis, or tables, cataloged the entire collection by subject and author, creating something the world had never had before: a library catalog. It's a detail easy to take for granted now, but somebody had to invent it, and it happened here. Then there was Eratosthenes, the Museon's chief librarian and a man of restless curiosity. Using nothing more than a stick, a well, and geometry, he compared the angle of the sun's shadow in two Egyptian cities on the same day and calculated the circumference of the earth. His answer was startlingly close to the true figure, achieved over 2,000 years before satellites, without ever leaving Egypt. Alexandria's scholars also did something quieter, but arguably just as consequential. They fixed the text of Homer. Before the library's editors got to work, the Iliad and the Odyssey existed in dozens of shifting oral and written variants. The versions we still read today descend largely from the editorial decisions made in Alexandria's reading rooms, which means, in a very real sense, this building shaped how Western literature would be read for the next 2,000 years. This was a place where geography, mathematics...
Our first suspect is also history's most famous one, and he didn't even mean to do it. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, chasing his rival Pompey through the chaos of Rome's civil war. He found himself outnumbered and trapped, his small force besieged in the city's harbor district by a much larger Egyptian fleet. So he made a ruthless decision. He ordered his own ships burned, denying them to the enemy before they could be used against him. According to the historian Plutarch, Writing more than a century later, the fire didn't stay contained to the harbor. It spread, jumping from ship to dock to warehouse, and by some accounts reached toward the library itself. Here's where the investigation gets interesting. Caesar wrote his own detailed account of this war. He was not a man who shied away from describing his victories. And in that account, the burning of the library, arguably the most culturally significant casualty of the entire campaign, goes entirely unmentioned. Silence, from the one person with every reason to boast about it, is its own kind of evidence. More damning still for this theory, the library demonstrably continued to exist for centuries after 48 BC. Scholars kept working there. Visitors kept describing it. Whatever burned that day in the harbor, it wasn't the whole story. So here's our first verdict. Caesar's fire almost certainly caused real damage, probably to warehouses storing scrolls near the docks, possibly to a portion of the library's holdings. But guilty of a fire is not the same as guilty of the ending. The library survived it, which means our mystery isn't solved. It's just getting started.
If Caesar isn't the culprit, most people assume the next suspect must be another fire, another dramatic villain. But the evidence points somewhere far less cinematic and far more disturbing. Here's the theory most modern historians actually favor. The library wasn't murdered. It was starved. Go back a century before Caesar, to 145 BC. A new king, Ptolemy VIII, seized the throne through a brutal succession struggle. And in the purge that followed, he expelled foreign scholars from Alexandria entirely. Overnight, the city lost much of the very talent that had made the library extraordinary. Many never came back. That single decision set a pattern. Later Ptolemaic rulers, and eventually the Roman emperors who succeeded them after Egypt fell to Rome, gave the library increasingly uneven support. Some patrons cared. Many didn't. Funding for new acquisitions slowed. Maintenance on the buildings lapsed. Scrolls made of papyrus don't last forever on their own. They need to be recopied, generation after generation, or they simply crumble. Without steady money and steady attention, that recopying stops happening. The damage compounded. In the chaos of the 270 CE, the Emperor Aurelian's war against the breakaway Palmyrene Empire brought fighting into Alexandria itself. 2 decades later, Emperor Diocletian's campaign to retake the city from a rebellion caused further destruction. Neither event targeted the library specifically, but neither event needed to. A weakened institution doesn't need a direct hit. It just needs enough neglect, layered under enough collateral damage, for a while. There was no single villain in this chapter of the investigation, just decades of indifference, which, it turns out, can be just as lethal as fire.
By the 4th century CE, the world that had built the library was disappearing, and the force replacing it was about to reach Alexandria's remaining books directly. The Roman Empire had converted. Christianity, once a persecuted minority faith, was now backed by imperial law, and across the empire, older religious sites were being shut down, repurposed, or destroyed. Alexandria was no exception. By this point, the library's main collection at the museum had likely already withered from centuries of the neglect we just traced. But a significant secondary collection still existed nearby, housed inside a temple to the god Serapis, known as the Serapeum. In 391 CE, the bishop of Alexandria, a man named Theophilus, led a campaign to tear down the city's pagan temples, acting on new imperial decrees from Emperor Theodosius that stripped legal protection from non-Christian worship. The Serapeum, one of the grandest temples in the ancient world, was a prime target. It fell. Here's where the investigation demands some honesty. We don't have an eyewitness account of scrolls burning that day. What we have is strong circumstantial reasoning. A major library annex, housed inside a temple that we know was destroyed, during a campaign that we know targeted religious sites specifically. Most historians consider it highly likely the Serapeum's books were lost in this destruction. But highly likely is not the same as documented.
What matters most for our investigation isn't the precise mechanics of that one event. It's what it represents. The moment religious upheaval, not military conquest, not a foreign invader, became a direct threat to what remained of Alexandria's great.
To understand what Alexandria lost next, we need to meet the person who embodied everything the library once stood for. Hypatia of Alexandria was born around 355 CE, the daughter of Theon, a mathematician and the last scholar formally attested to have worked at the Moision. She grew into something remarkable in her own right, a mathematician, an astronomer, and the leading philosopher of Alexandria's Neoplatonist school. She wrote commentaries on Euclid and Diophantus that helped preserve their work for later generations. Students traveled from across the empire to study under her, pagan and Christian alike. In a world that rarely gave women any formal claim to scholarship, Hypatia was, by every account, one of the most respected intellectuals alive. That respect made her powerful, and in Alexandria in 415 CE, power made her a target. The city was gripped by a bitter feud between two men, Orestes, the Roman prefect, and Cyril, Alexandria's ambitious bishop. Hypatia was close to Orestes, and rumors spread blaming her for blocking any reconciliation between the two rivals. In March of 415, a mob, incited by that political and religious tension, seized her from her carriage as she traveled through the city. She was dragged to a church and killed. Her body was destroyed afterward. The ancient...
There's one more suspect left in this investigation, and it's the one most people already believe is guilty. The story goes like this. In 642 CE, the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria for the growing Islamic Caliphate. According to legend, he wrote to Caliph Omar asking what to do with the city's remaining books. Omar's supposed answer became infamous, that the books either agreed with the Quran, making them redundant, or contradicted it, making them heretical. Either way, they were ordered burned, allegedly fueling the city's bathhouses for 6 months. It's a vivid story. It's also almost certainly fiction. Here's the problem. This account doesn't appear in any source from the time of the conquest, or for 500 years afterward. The earliest known version of this story was written in the 12th century, by which point it had passed through centuries of retelling, with no earlier corroboration at all. And there's a more basic issue. By 642 CE, there's no solid evidence the library's books, or even the buildings that once housed them, still existed in any meaningful form. You can't burn what's already gone. Most historians today treat this story as exactly what it looks like, a legend invented centuries later, likely shaped by later political and religious tensions, rather than anything that actually happened in Alexandria's harbor. So we can clear this suspect. Which leaves us with something more interesting than a culprit, a pattern.
So, we asked at the start of this investigation whether humanity lost its greatest treasure. It's time to deliver a verdict. It wasn't Caesar. His fire was real, but the library survived him by centuries. It wasn't a single mob, a single bishop, or a single caliph, however satisfying it might be to name one villain and close the case. The honest answer is less cinematic and, frankly, more unsettling. The Library of Alexandria wasn't murdered. It died the way most great things quietly die, through 200 years of accumulated damage that no single generation was fully responsible for, and no single generation fully noticed happening. A fire that damaged what it never fully destroyed. A king who expelled the scholars who made the place matter. Emperors who stopped caring enough to fund it properly. A temple torn down in a religious struggle that had nothing to do with books and everything to do with power. And finally, the murder of the one woman who still represented what Alexandria used to be, after which no one seriously believed the light could be relit. So did humanity lose its greatest treasure? Yes, but not in the way the legend tells it. We lost it slowly, through neglect as much as violence, through indifference as much as fire.
And maybe that's the more important lesson sitting underneath this whole mystery. Libraries, knowledge, whole intellectual traditions, they don't require a villain to disappear. They just require enough people to stop protecting them. Today, a new library stands near the same stretch of Alexandria's coastline. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in 2002, makes no claim to be the original, rebuilt.